Yo, what's up, you guys? It's your girl, Trudy LPC, and thank you for tuning in to our new season of Self-Aware and Effed Up. I know it's been a while, but we are back once again, and we're doing things a bit differently now. So quite a few things have changed since the last episode, like, a whole entire pandemic, but we're back and better than ever. For those of you guys who are tuning in for the first time, I want to give you guys a brief snapshot about what this podcast is all about. So Self-Aware and Effed Up was born out of the idea that while we may have the best of intentions about our life choices and decisions, sometimes in spite of everything, all of our self-awareness about our issues, we are still flawed individuals who sometimes make piss poor decisions. So the podcast actually seeks to tackle taboo topics in mental health, and you might find yourself too asking, am I too self-aware and effed up? So my name is Trudy LPC, and I am a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia, and I am your host. And when you really take a look at my life, you can definitely see that I am truly self-aware and effed up, but I wouldn't trade this journey for the world. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get into it. I have a very special guest for you guys today. Her name is Dr. Michele Finneran, and we're going to talk with her a little bit about domestic violence. It's something that I've seen so much in my life. So just want to be able to share this topic with you guys and really chat with you guys about what, how, who, what, when, where, all of that good stuff related to domestic violence. So we're going to go ahead and talk with Dr. Michele Finneran. All right, guys. So as I promised you guys, I have a very special guest with me today. She is from the state of Florida. Her name is Dr. Michele Finneran, and she is the owner and operator of VEC Counseling Associates in Florida. She is a licensed clinical mental health counselor, and I'm so excited to have her. So welcome to the show, Dr. Michele Finneran. Hey, Dr. Finneran, how are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me. It's such an awesome to finally meet you and connect with you, Centuries. It's been awesome corresponding with you. I love what you're doing on your podcast. It's super amazing. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me onto your show.
Thank you so much for reaching out. I was really happy when I got a chance to read the first email that you sent when you reached out, and just really reading about you and learning a little bit more about you. I was really impressed with your work and the topic that you talk about in your book. It's so amazing. Domestic violence is just something that is really tricky sometimes to deal with. And so it's great to kind of see your niche that you've kind of found for yourself and really being able to provide the supports, helping people understand better about how to work with people with who have experienced domestic violence, as well as also kind of giving some detail to the individuals in their lives who may be able to look at certain warning signs. So I did want to just ask, do you mind telling us a little bit about your background and how you became involved in helping victims of domestic violence or working with the domestic violence population?
Sure. So I've been in the field of mental health it started really young when I was like 18, 19 years old and undergrad. So I did about over 20 years span of mental health. I did 10 of which have been in community mental health centers, working with chronic mental health illness, and then and substance abuse. And then I did the last 13 years of my professional clinical career in private practice, which is called, like you said, VEC Associates, located in Coral Springs, Florida. So basically, I treat preteens, teens, adults, adolescents, marriages and couples, families, and communities. So right now, I have a PhD in conflict resolution, which is conflict resolution and dispute analysis, which helps deal with two or more people in conflict. So families, marriages, and also communities. I contract with some municipalities, some cities. I contract with some organizations, and anything that more than one person in the population that I'm dealing with it goes toward my PhD in conflict resolution and dispute analysis. The LMHC, which I'm licensed in the state of Florida, is working. That's how I'm able to open my private practice, is working with individuals and working with either individuals or couples, stuff like that. So my niche in my practice is really dealing with law enforcement officers, first responders, and service providers. So it's working with people who help people. Now, that's in my clinical practice. My research is a completely different hemisphere. My research is done in domestic abuse. And the reason why I got into this particular book and this researching and surveying, interviewing survivors of domestic violence is when I was back in my PhD program, I worked for a local jail in the community, and I worked with female incarcerated inmates. Okay. Oh. And I was working in my PhD and still trying to figure out what I wanted to do for my dissertation. And as I ran groups, I ran like two hour blocks of groups of working on domestic violence, anger management, and conflict resolution unit. I would do groups, and I would facilitate psychoeducational groups for them. There are times where I do individual counseling and get to know a little bit more in depth about the inmates. And what I realized that I discovered when working and talking with the female incarcerated women were that a lot of these women were victims of domestic violence. And that absolutely floored me. I didn't realize that they got caught up in a very broken system.
Yeah.
So I went back to my PhD chair and I said, listen, I think we have a problem here, Houston. I think we have a real big problem here. I'm seeing some things that I didn't think I was going to see ever in the legal system. And she's basically said, I said, I'm seeing a lot of victims of domestic violence that have been victimized that are incarcerated. And I said, why is that? And she's like, well, why don't you do your research and find out where the gaps are? So I did. So I did the research and I found out there is absolutely no type of support or help formally, or different formal supports in the effective ways in which to help victim population, and in no way formal supports how informally to support victims of domestic violence. So when we talk about formal supports, we're talking about professionals, we're talking about law enforcement, we're talking about counselors, we're talking about clergy, we're talking about medical staff, we're talking about judicial system, we're talking about all those formal supports that have been utilized. And we're talking about informal supports, we're specifically talking about parents, relatives, friends, coworkers, and bosses. So I was this epiphany kind of fell upon me, and I realized, wow, this is a systemic issue that we're dealing with, a huge systemic issue. So I talked to my professor, my chair at the time, and I decided that how I wanted to approach this is I wanted to interview survivors and get testimonies directly from the survivors of what worked in utilizing formal supports and what didn't work, and what worked in utilizing their informal supports and what didn't work. Mm. And so when I interviewed, I did a semi-structured qualitative study where I did 90-minute interviews. And I have to tell you something, Centrise, these interviews were absolutely amazing. I mean, super eye-opening for me as not only trying to pass my dissertation, but as a clinician, just working with these testimonies and these stories that were different, but yet the same. It was the weirdest thing. So that's how the dissertation came to be. And then when the dissertation was submitted and approved and published and I graduated, I could not let go of the material that I got. And I felt it was such an important information and piece that I wanted to publish it.
Wow.
So I researched publications, and I got in contact with an academic publishing company called Routledge Taylor Francis Group. And they're an academic publishing group based out of London, and they have satellite offices. And that's when this dissertation and book came to be.
Oh, wow. That's absolutely amazing. I know I got a chance to read a little bit about what you've done and the book itself, in the prep process for this particular episode, but it's just amazing kind of hearing you talk about it and really seeing, that it sounds like you're really passionate about what you do, and really, the interviews, I'm sure those were absolutely amazing because
off the charts, eye-opening and pivotal. When you're a researcher in academia, separate from being a clinician, obviously how I attacked the interviews was not from a clinical standpoint. It was more of an interviewer academia standpoint. What's called saturation of data is when people that you're interviewing or that you're semi-structured interviewing are all coming up with the same type of responses. So there was definitely some areas that I want to point out when we get on into the interview. So where the saturation of data was, like what was everyone pretty much people say the same thing. That's a saturation of data.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't know, just hearing you talk about it, like I said, it really is an amazing thing that you've been able to do, because I think about clients that I've worked with that have been in situations like that where they, didn't really have the support. And as a clinician, you want to be able to provide them with different tools and different things that they can use. But I've not seen a lot out there myself as it relates to this. And I've worked in domestic violence shelters. I think I did one of my internships in that. And that was like many years ago. I think it was like 2011 when I did my internship at a domestic violence shelter. And it's just so interesting seeing the women kind of having to put their lives back together. And I know it's not always men that are women that are victims. I understand that sometimes there are men. In your research, were you able to work with any men who had experienced issues with domestic violence?
No, in the incarceration of when working for the local jail, there was many perpetrators. I didn't, okay. but nowadays more so now, lately there's been more victims male victims coming out and really speaking, which they have a whole nother set of, presenting issues versus, female victims of domestic violence.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you definitely saw that there was a need, and you were able to expand on your work from your studies and be really in your research and really be able to provide something that I think is going to be helpful for a lot of clinicians that are seeing this. I know it takes a lot for people who are victims of domestic violence to come and actually get support because of fear. What advice would you give to people who may have family or friends that are in a domestic violence situation? What advice might you give to them to help the individuals in their lives that they care about get out of those situations?
Absolutely. So in my book, there's 3 sections. One is called Seeking Help. One is called Formal Supports. And the other is called Informal Supports, 3 sections. And what you're asking me is, how can family and friends help?
Yeah.
One of the things that is not helpful that you would be shocked to hear that parents do, particularly mothers kind of do, is they bash the perpetrator. They bash the abuser. They name call. They put them down. Even if the victim is name calling and putting them down, to have their family member do it is actually not helpful. Actually not helpful for the victim, because what it does is just staples the idea that they've made a wrong decision in their lives. Mm-hmm. The person that has abused them, the victim has also a twisted feeling of wanting to protect them, which is called the Stockholm syndrome,
right?
Of wanting to protect them. So victims kind of get very defensive when their family members name call the abuser, the perpetrator, because they're still in a protective mode and have been for a long time. So that's just not helpful that family members do that and friends do that. They end up bashing. Instead, it's hard as a family member because you want to bash. You want to bash them, but for the person, for their daughter or the person who's receiving that, it's just not helpful. Just try to stay as neutral as you possibly can, not taking sides, because what's also detrimental is mothers and fathers kind of take the side of the abuser, which is, again, not helpful for the victim. So it's kind of this middle ground area where parents really have to stay in the middle in terms of providing not just tangible support like the babysitting or moving or financially, but a lot of the survivors that I studied and I interviewed, the saturation of data that I was telling you earlier, a lot of these victims of survivors had a very disconnected and unemotionally available attachment to their mothers. A lot of them. And you would think it would be the father, but it's not.
Yeah, I would definitely think it would be the father in that case, just from...
It's the mother. The mothers are the ones who are historically unemotional, detached, and not emotionally available for their daughters, growing up, rearing. And then also what they see is victims see their mothers at times witnessing domestic violence in their own relationship. And that's called learned helplessness, where you actually witness and be exposed to your mother's victimization. And it's almost like this generational cycle of victimization throughout the women in particular families.
Right. Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, obviously the name of the podcast is Self-Aware and Effed Up. So I definitely saw situations growing up with my mom being abused by her first husband. And I can only I think it taught me that that's something that I definitely didn't want to be a part of. And I didn't want to engage in a relationship, but I did eventually later in life end up in emotionally abusive relationships. And so it wasn't physical, but there still was a layer of abuse based on some of the abuse that I saw. So it's interesting to say that the connection sometimes is with the mother. Wow.
Yeah, it's a correlation. And, emotional abuse is still considered domestic violence.
Yeah.
That's domestic violence, emotional abuse. Now, in terms of her law enforcement, it's not as evident when there's emotional abuse unless it turns physical, because when it's physical, there's actual tangible evidence that abuse has taken place. When you have emotional abuse, there's nothing tangible that another person, law enforcement, can see that can cause for an arrest or cause for a charge for domestic violence. So what happens is emotional abuse gets so intense and so escalated that it ends up turning into physical abuse, which then, unfortunately, again, a very reactive system. That's when law enforcement can intervene and make some help, do their own kind of support and help.
Gotcha. Yeah. So if, speaking from the perspective of a family member who maybe is noticing things that may be going on, if a person may be in a domestic violence situation, what are some of the signs that you kind of can recognize that something like that is going on?
Well, the person who has been victimized, their personality starts to change a little bit. Obviously, their personality starts to change. They start to become a little bit more withdrawn. And less inclusive in their family, and more isolative and segregated between their family members and their perpetrator. And that's twofold. That's one, because the perpetrator is actually unconsciously or consciously doing that, isolating the victim from their family, or it's the victim feeling ashamed and embarrassed as to having a perpetrator in their lives, and therefore isolating themselves consciously or unconsciously from their family members in order for others not to really know what's going on behind closed doors.
Yeah.
So it's isolation. It's isolation. The biggest thing is like when the victims start to begin to isolate from their family dynamics, when they haven't been typically.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that and see that kind of, even just going back to talking about the experience that I had with emotional abuse. There was definitely a lot of isolation there, and, making me feel like I wasn't worthy, and making me feel that, my family didn't care about me, and all I had was her family to be a part of. And so it was just good 3 years that I didn't have contact with my family or anything, because I was embarrassed because I allowed someone to treat me that way. And so I think it is good to be able to kind of recognize those signs, and provide that support. I think what you said earlier about not bashing the person, that definitely resonated with me as you was talking about it, because that was one of the things that I got a lot of at that particular time in my life. So I'm just curious, what do you think are some of the barriers to someone who is in a situation like, myself at that particular time? What do you think are some of the main barriers to them being able to get out of that situation? I know you mentioned Stockholm, so just kind of.
Yeah. So the first section of my book is solely based on seeking help and the barriers to seeking help. So I take seeking help as a subheading, and that's one part of it. And on the side of seeking help is just lack of awareness that abuse is actually occurring. I mean, not to discredit the survivor or the victim, but you don't really, something is wrong, but you're not really understanding like it's actually what it actually is. You don't feel good. The other person's not making you feel good, but you can't really identify it as abuse, emotional abuse, physical, unless, it's not as, when you're in the relationship, it's hard to recognize it when you're in the relationship. versus when you're out of it. So when you're in the relationship, you feel something is wrong. And it's not so much denial, maybe it's like a lack of unconscious awareness that this is actually considered abuse. So that's one barrier of seeking help that I came across. On the other sphere of seeking help is the Stockholm syndrome. And the Stockholm syndrome is based on, really relating and identifying with your abuser and your perpetrator and protecting them and having that emotional traumatic bonding with them. So that's one thing. That emotional traumatic bonding is actually a very twisted type of unhealthy kind of toxic dynamic to be in.
Yeah.
Because you feel emotionally obligated and protective of your abuser, who's then toxic and abusing you. And that kind of staples the person in a victimization. So the main question as to why don't you just leave is a very challenging and complex question to ask, and not really a fair one. If providers and service providers and people that are helping victims formally don't understand that it's an emotional traumatic bonding that keeps the victim stapled and situated there, and which I considered in the book called Stockholm syndrome. And then in terms of lack of awareness, and maybe even some sort of denial, our portrayal of what domestic violence is in social media is false. So that's one thing. It's not like in the movies, and it doesn't have to become life-threatening in order for it to be abusive, but typically it ends up being that way. It doesn't have to be physically or emotionally life-threatening. And there's a lot of another barrier that happens when victims try to seek help is they're humiliated, they're embarrassed, to speak up and seek out any type of help. So that's another reason why. And, not all domestic violence situations are the same. So you can't attack it from a one size fits all. It's not cookie cutter like that. So it's very individualized, but depending on the victims, what they're experiencing in their abusive dynamic and what they need in terms of support. So when I interviewed survivors, I had people needing law enforcement. I had people needing different types of formal supports based on what the dynamics of their abusive relationship. So lack of awareness or denial, not like in the movies, life-threatening, humiliation and embarrassment, and not one size fits all. And then on the other side of barriers of seeking help is the Stockholm syndrome, which is probably the biggest thing to kind of just understand and nail down for people that are helping victims, is protecting the abuser, the victim protecting the abuser.
Okay. Absolutely. Thank you for kind of explaining that piece of it. As you were speaking, I was thinking back to just situations I've had with friends who have been in situations like that. And it is challenging as a loved one to see someone go through that, want to help them, but know that regardless of how much you want to help them and want to be there for them, that they're not going to necessarily be able to leave until they're ready to leave that particular situation. And I'm sure you've probably seen it even in a counseling setting before someone that they may get to that point where they put the person out and they're moving on with their lives. And then you go a couple of weeks into counseling and then that person starts to show back up. They love bomb them. They do things to try to get them back. And then, slowly but surely, usually that person, if they're not ready yet, they end up leaving counseling. What would you say to someone who is like myself, sometimes a bit cynical about working with domestic violence victims or helping them in your family because you feel like you're going to be the one that's frustrated in the end because they're not changing or moving at the pace that you would want them to move?
Definitely. In terms of, I have down performance supports in terms of mental health providers and professionals who are working with domestic violence victims at the time. It's very interesting because, as therapists, obviously we have sort of our own agendas and our own biases. However, a victim comes to you and our go-to is, well, you got to leave. We need to build a safety plan. We need to get you safe, which is understandable. But the clinician has to understand that in order to be of service to the victim, you got to meet the victim where they're at. They may be in an abusive relationship, but they may not be ready to leave the relationship. They just may need to process what's happening to them. And so many times what I wrote in the book is many times the feedback that I got from the survivors, they weren't allowed in the therapeutic process to process their abuse, to process their story. And probably for the first time, that's where you do it the first time is in a clinical, professional, therapeutic setting. They weren't able to process it because the therapist had their own kind of agenda and quickly went to safety planning, which is not really where the victim was. You know, the clinician does the victim a disservice by speeding up their own process,
right,
and not meeting the victim where they're at in a therapeutic dynamic. So one of the things that therapists need to do is allow ample time for the victim to process their abuse. And if it's too hard for the therapist to hear, then they should be working with this population. So you got to know what you can and can't do as a clinician. So allowing that ample time, and probably for the first time, the victim processing their story and their abuse, ample time for that until they feel like they've said all that they need, get everything off their chest, said everything they need to say. And then you kind of assess where the victim is at. It's a slow step-by-step process. You just can't come in and say, I've been a victim of domestic violence and go right to safety planning and right to like, let's do an escape plan from your perpetrator, where that's not where the victim is emotionally. So yeah, I would say that that's pretty much the big disservices that clinicians do when working with the population of domestic violence survivors is they move on their own agenda too quickly and they don't meet the client, the victim, where they're at emotionally. And that's why they end up leaving therapy.
Right. Yeah, I can definitely understand that. I mean, as I said, I'm definitely a bias, and that's not a population that I'm too comfortable working with because it's triggering for me because of my past history of seeing my mom and my past history of being in an emotionally abusive relationship. And I know that that's not my niche, and I know that that's not where, that's not my client. And that's why I really, yeah.
I think it's great for you to even recognize that about yourself, what your limitations are and what you can't do therapeutically. I know there are certain populations that I will not work with, because of my own history or because it's not really where I want to go therapeutically. So I know there's two areas in my clinical practice that I will not take on. And so with that being said, it's good to know that about yourself as a clinician of what some of the things that you can do and what you can't do clinically. Because if you do it clinically and you're not capable of doing it clinically, you might be doing counterproductive.
Absolutely. So I'll be referring them to you in the future. But yeah, so I'm curious, you've talked a little bit about the research. You've talked about, the different populations in terms of you being able to do the research. What's one thing you wish everyone knew about survivors of domestic abuse? And what's one thing, about from your research that you really, really want the world to know?
I would have to say when it comes to domestic abuse and domestic violence, like it could be anybody. Anybody could be targeted. Anybody could be a victim. Anybody could be a survivor. So don't be so flippant in having conversations around women and people that you don't know really their backstory. I just feel like it could be anybody that you are talking to that has been a victim or a survivor of domestic violence. So I just feel like careful communication around this topic is always going to be on the forefront, because it could be anyone. It does not discriminate. It doesn't care if you have high socioeconomic status. It doesn't care if you are in a high-powered position as a woman. It doesn't matter if you are just a mother. It does not discriminate, and it does not care. So be careful with when talking about and who you're talking about when you bring up sensitive topics like domestic abuse, because you might be talking to a victim or a survivor yourself.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's definitely something that's necessary for people to be aware of. We never know what someone is going through. We never know their story. I know that, you and I dialogued a little bit back and forth in planning for this episode, but I didn't share that, I had a history with that because I felt, I don't even know if I made that connection until we were talking, actually, to be perfectly honest with you. So it is important to pay attention to those things. Are there any other key areas from your research that you want to highlight?
I just feel like, the sense of like empowerment for women, I think is such a good therapeutic and theoretical model to kind of abide by. Like women, oftentimes strong women, or even women in general, have tendencies to bring each other down. And that's really not where we need to be as a culture and a society. We really need to be, as women, bringing each other up and empowering them to be strong and facilitate some, strength and some courage when they might not have it on their own, and not talk bad about them or degrade them or look down and put them up to them. So I think a sense of a sphere of culture and a sphere of empowerment for women, I think is really what I like to see futuristically encompassing women helping women in general, or women standing up for women in general.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk with me about this subject. I could see your passion just even in reading about you and learning a little bit more about you, but talking with you definitely brought it all together, and I can hear the passion in your voice. So I thank you for what you do for this population, because they are definitely, I feel like underserved because the people aren't necessarily equipped with how to deal with it. And our biases definitely play a role in how we work with clients. And I think it's important for family members to know how to work with, and help their family members, as well as for clinicians to be able to definitely provide that service. So I want to kind of close things off by you letting us know, how can our listeners reach you? How can they reach you? How can they purchase your book? I just want to put that on out there so that we can definitely make sure that people are more aware of how to work with clients and how to help their loved ones.
Sure. So anytime anyone wants to reach me, I can be reached on my website. If you just on the URL site, it's drmichelefinarin.com. Straight drmichelefinarin.com. Michele is spelled with one L. My last name is spelled FINNERAN.com. And on that website, there's blogs, there's videos that I've done. There's also a place, and it says contact us. You can contact me via my website, and you can ask me all kinds of questions that you want to ask or discuss with me. I can't treat anybody clinically unless it's in the state of Florida, because that's where my license is at. But I can correspond and discuss things with people seeking consultation or advice in terms of this area or other areas. That's the best way to reach me. To order my book, it's through Amazon. If you type in Amazon books and you type in Surviving Domestic Abuse, the full title is called Surviving Domestic Abuse, Formal and Informal Supports and Services. But if you just type in Surviving Domestic Abuse, you'll see my name on the book and kind of like the book itself. It's sold in paperback and hardback, and it's also on Kindle. So those are three ways in which you can utilize it. And you can also go to Rutledge Taylor Francis and Group website, academic website, and you can order it from their website, which is my publishing company.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you so much for being a part of this project. I don't know how much you know about the Self-Aware and FW project, but it's something very near and dear to my heart. I love mental health. I've been in the mental health field really since 2004. I've only been fully licensed since 2016, but I've been in the field started out working in the inpatient setting and in group homes and inpatient psych, and currently I work for a crisis line, the Veterans Crisis Line. And so it's a lot of stuff in my background that I just really want to be able to highlight. And when you reached out and you just seeing what you were talking about, it was just really important for me to have you on the show. So I thank you so much for reaching out and coming to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I got to tell you something, your podcast, you might not be aware of this, but this is how domestic violence victims and people that have mental health, how they educate themselves is through these types of podcasts, through your podcasts. When they're not aware, they feel something is wrong, but they're not aware. They do their own preliminary research and they stumble upon podcasts like this or articles that they learn and they read and they educate themselves. So this podcast and platform is very important for audience to understand more about mental health and mental health well-being and domestic violence.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. Thank you for being a guest. We are going to wrap this thing up, but I want to thank everyone who's listening for tuning in. Be sure to follow me on all social media platforms under the handle Treaty LPC. Stay tuned for new episodes that'll be dropping weekly very, very soon. So until next time, be safe, be well, and be true. Peace and love.
Bye.
Bye.